Notre Dame, 47. Clemson, 40. A lot of times these games are built up. A lot of times they don't deliver. But woo, this one delivered last night. Goes into overtime. Got to go right back to what we were just talking about. If you're watching this video individually, this is part of Late Kick Live overall, so Colin has cut the video out if you're watching it later. But I was just a couple of minutes ago talking about the difference between can't and haven't. A lot of people say Brian Kelly can't win the big game. A lot of people had previously said Brian Kelly can't beat an elite team like a Clemson or an Alabama. No, that's never been true. He hasn't. There's a big difference between hasn't and can't. Brian Kelly hadn't, but now he has. Now, earlier this year, I was talking to Brian Kelly when it was the middle of the offseason, and I really was struck by just how brutally honest he is about everything. So sometimes you got to handle coaches in a little more PR-centric kind of way, and they got some talking points they want you to toss to him, and you get the sense early on this interview is not really going to accomplish much. Brian Kelly's not like that. Brian Kelly's really honest. He's really open, really forthright. And so, since I was doing an interview you guys were going to see anyway, I said, I know good and well what our viewers want to know. So I'm just going to ask this guy. Colin, let's cue this up. This is a couple of months ago, myself talking to Brian Kelly, and I want you to keep in mind what you saw last night as you listen to his response to this question.
And yet there's this tier, and that's the way that people look at college football now, in tiers, and you got Clemson and Alabama, and folks don't necessarily throw Notre Dame in that top tier yet. And I would imagine it's because there hasn't been that national championship. There's no doubt Notre Dame's close. Is there a feeling internally, or maybe you don't even look at it like this, but is there a feeling internally that there's one more step we got to take? And if so, what is that next step? What comes in that final step of the process?
Well, I think the final step is to continue. You have to do this on a consistent basis. 3 double-digit win seasons, 4 out of 5 is beginning to show signs of that consistency. But I think that has to come first. Consistently, double-digit wins puts you then in a position where you can recruit at the highest level. Then I think the final stage of that is you have to break through and win one of those games. We've been in a number of those, and I've led our team to a number of those games, and we, quite frankly, have not broken through. We will. I had a similar situation at the other programs that I've been at, and we had to keep banging at that door, but we finally broke through, and we'll break through at Notre Dame.
So a few takeaways. Number one, the guy on the right needs to buy a few more white shirts. Number two takeaway here, though, in a much more serious manner, is they won a game last night against Clemson, who had a number 1 next to their name. I don't care who was out. Did you see who was in? I'll get to that in a second. I know Trevor Lawrence was out. I know they had a couple of defensive guys out. But like I just asked you, did you see who was in? Because I've been told about 1,000 times today, if I've been told once, that once these two teams play again, and they probably will, Trevor Lawrence will just mop the floor with Clemson. Could I ask you something? 29 of 44, 439 yards and 2 touchdowns. Is Trevor Lawrence putting up a stat line a whole lot better than that? I don't think so. You know how I don't? Because he hasn't so far. And so DJ Uiagalelei played out of his mind last night. That was winning football he played. They didn't win the game, but that was winning football. As we said leading up to the game last week, that wasn't going to be the problem for Notre Dame, or it wasn't going to be the problem for Clemson, rather. The problem is going to be the defensive guys they were missing. Now, if you're going to insinuate to me that once Clemson is 100% defensively, then it's going to be a lot tougher task for Notre Dame, well, I'll grant you that. It was a tough task for them last night. But, I mean, let's not pretend every single bounce in that game went Notre Dame's way either. There were, a lot of things, I call them bob plays. They could be flags. They could be a random fumble into the end zone. All sorts of things that make or break a game. But Clemson had no weakness at quarterback last night. So let's dive into this a little ways. Because last night, DJ Uiagalelei wrecked what was going to be a great padlock stat in this game. As I told you, there were some fake padlock stats out there last night. What if I were to tell you Friday morning that total rushing, Notre Dame was going to have 41 attempts for 209 rushing yards. That's 5.1 per carry. Clemson was going to have 33 runs for 34 total rushing yards. I did the math. That's about 1 yard per carry. DJ Uiagalelei almost wrecked that single-handedly. That kind of rushing disparity normally exists in a 3+ touchdown win. And yet that guy played so out of his mind last night, Clemson almost still won the game. So their vulnerability was not offensive. And I don't care when Trevor Lawrence comes back, you better get a much better defensive effort or you're going to have the same kind of game. Notre Dame is overrated is probably something I'm told every day, every time the hour hand passes 12. It's like on the hour, every hour, someone's got to tell me that. And I've always pushed back on it, only because I don't know of anyone that's overrating them. Anyone whose opinion really matters, okay? I'm not talking about your Uncle Jethro. I'm talking about folks whose opinion really matters. I've not seen to this point this year, I had not seen anyone put Notre Dame above Ohio State or Alabama or Clemson. Until last night, mind you, I had not seen anyone doing that. And so, aside from that group, they're about as good as anyone else out there, or they have been so far this year. No one's overrated them. Not many people had overrated them. This game's going to resonate. I'm telling you, this game's going to resonate. Will there be a rematch? There probably will. Will they be an underdog in it? They absolutely will. Will it be a blowout? I think that's very unlikely, but consider what Notre Dame wants to sell, and then consider what America saw last night. Because we've talked about this many times with Notre Dame. They, like many teams out there, grant you, are a quarterback away. We say it about Penn State all the time, and boy, do we have a lot to say about Penn State coming up later in the show. But we say it about Penn State. We've said it about Notre Dame. How different would that program be if you just took an elite quarterback and put it on the roster, keep everything else as is? Well, they don't have that right now. And so in lieu of that, we said last week, in order for this game to be competitive, all you need is Ian Book to play the best game of his career, which sounded far-fetched, but I did kind of draw a comparison to what Jake Fromm was able to do a couple of times against Alabama. Jake Fromm was quarterback for Georgia, had a very good career, not a great career, but a very good career, but he played great football in the biggest moments against Alabama. You wouldn't expect that. You'd think he'd light up Vanderbilt or South Carolina. No, man, he did it against Alabama. So I said, if Notre Dame's going to win the game, Ian Book needs to do that. This kid last night goes 23 of 39, 310 yards and a touchdown. That is not an Ian Book stat line. But yet, that's what he did last night. Needed the game of his career, got the game of his career. I was very happy. Sometimes you guys claim I'm biased, and I'm not. I always tell you, you don't need to guess. I'll tell you. So I had a bias in this game last night. I was pulling for Notre Dame. Plenty of times I pull for Clemson. It's not an anti-Clemson thing, but I was pulling for Notre Dame last night. I've just always had it. Well, I haven't always. Actually, I was raised to hate Notre Dame. But when I went up there in 2017 for that Georgia game, it was the first time I'd been up there. And it felt kind of like a movie scene, mainly because it is. But my only impression of South Bend had been the movie Rudy. So I went up there, fell in love with the place. Southern hospitality is a real thing. But the folks in South Bend, Indiana, acted like they were from Opelika, Alabama. So it felt like I was home. It's just the Southern accents weren't there, and there was a little bit more corn. But it was great. I loved it up there. So I kind of have had a little side rooting interest for Notre Dame. And I like tradition. I very much respect the tradition of college football. So I was pulling for them last night. So I was very happy to see it. So I had bias in this game, to be perfectly clear. They had to make someone not named Travis Etienne beat them. I did like 4 radio hits. And I did one in Indiana. I did a few in the Carolinas last week. And every one of them, I said the same thing. And that's not rocket science, but they did it. Travis Etienne, you could have made the argument, was the best football player on the field last night, going into the game at least. And yet there he is, 18 carries for 28 yards. Also, not to be overlooked, the punter hawked him down before the half. That was huge. Tried to hurdle him. Punters, not to be trifled with, at Notre Dame at least. So you may think Clemson is going to win this rematch when it happens. You may think that. I may think that when it comes. I'm not going to make any prediction right now. Let's make sure the game happens first. But I don't necessarily know that it matters all that. It matters, but I don't know that it matters all that much within the context of what was accomplished last night for Notre Dame. This is a huge deal. I don't think maybe we will fully understand it until history is able to look back on it. Because like I said with Florida beating Georgia, it's all about what they do with it. Well, it's all about what Brian Kelly and Notre Dame do with this win. But number one, now we know Clemson has to get to the ACC title game, which they probably will. Number two, it could be the case at this point that Notre Dame sees themselves in a position where they can afford to lose the ACC title game and still make the playoff. You never know. Maybe Ohio State's in, maybe Bama's in, maybe Clemson's in, maybe there's room. Maybe we're comparing Texas A&M, a 2-loss Florida, Notre Dame 1 loss. Maybe that's what we're doing. You just got to make sure You win your games and take care of business so that now, instead of there being one narrow path, Notre Dame's got a couple of paths. When's the last time you said that about the Irish? So congratulations to Brian Kelly and company there.